Hello everybody, and welcome back to Rishi Outpost. Today I want to talk about something that's always on my mind when it comes to Star Wars: continuity. I'm making this video now because of the Bad Batch season premiere, which, despite being an enjoyable first episode of the series, really rubbed me the wrong way for one major reason. Its opening scenes, which show Caleb Dume, aka Kanan Jarrus, in the moments during and directly after Order 66. As many of you probably already know, this episode contradicted the events of the Kanan comic series, published by Marvel in 2015 to tie into the Rebels TV show that was airing at the time. The problem is, this is not the first time that we've seen a Star Wars show treading on continuity established in the books and comics since the establishment of the Lucasfilm story group, which was promised to fans as a group that would keep all of Star Wars media consistent. In fact, the last 3 seasons of Star Wars television, despite being otherwise great so far, have butted up against other parts of the continuity in one way or another. Both Season 7 of The Clone Wars and Season 2 of The Mandalorian have had some contradictions with books and comics, and I want to talk about each of these instances because I think each situation is a little bit different, and it seems that Lucasfilm is lacking a guiding philosophy in this arena, which I hope to provide here. Not that anyone is listening, of course, but it's still interesting to think about. I want to start with the example that brought about the least significant retcons. Cobb Vanth's backstory in Season 2 of The Mandalorian compared to the Aftermath trilogy of novels by Chuck Wendig. Many people might not know that Cobb Vanth, the man wearing Boba Fett's armor at the beginning of Season 2, was actually first in the Aftermath trilogy. He's a very small character in those books, who has a chapter dedicated to him in each book, giving him all of about 10 pages of book time by the end of the trilogy. Nevertheless, it introduces him as the mayor or sheriff of Mos Pelgos, also called Freetown in the books, and as the man who got Boba Fett's armor from the Jawas. There are some discrepancies between the show and the books that are pretty minor but worth talking about. In the books, there is no mention of Vanth being stranded in the desert, which is a key part of the story in the show. In the books, Vanth fights off a scout from the Red Key Mining Corporation when he's buying the armor, something that isn't mentioned in the show. In the books, Vanth finds the Rancor Keeper from Jabba's palace, Maliki, and recruits him to live in Mos Pelgos, so he can help him take care of a baby hut, which is also omitted from the show. The books also show the reader that the residents of Mos Pelgos and the local Tusken Raiders had a good relationship. They even team up to fight off the Red Key Mining Corporation in the books, despite having an antagonistic relationship in the show. Now, I think you can actually square all of these discrepancies with minimal head warping. Perhaps Vanth just didn't tell Mando about when he fought the guy in the Sandcrawler. Maybe Maliki was teaching the baby hut inside when Mando is in Mos Pelgos in the show, and since the show takes place about 5 years after the books, you could say that the relationship between the town and the Tusken Raiders broke down. I think you can make those arguments and be technically correct that the continuity is maintained. It just doesn't feel like the show tried to line up with all the elements of the books. It feels to me like the show took the elements from the books that the showrunners thought were cool and ignored the elements that they didn't like. This is a philosophy that works perfectly fine for something like the Marvel Cinematic Universe as it relates to its comic books, and I think it can even work for Star Wars by taking ideas from Star Wars Legends. But the Aftermath books are supposed to be canon, according to Lucasfilm. That should mean they're fully canon, not canon to the extent that is convenient for the writers and directors of the television shows and movies. I don't want to rag on this example too much because they're technically not contradictions if you think about it in the right way. It's just something I think is worth considering. The second example of the canon problem is the discrepancies between the Clone Wars Season 7 and the Ahsoka novel by E.K. Johnston on how the Siege of Mandalore is described. Ahsoka was a novel published in 2016 when the Clone Wars Season 7 was already being worked on. For some reason, however, no one mentioned to Johnston that the Siege of Mandalore events were subject to change, so they were included in flashback scenes in the novel, and in the novel they appear differently than they appear in the show. I think this speaks to poor communication on the part of the story group, because if they had known that the Siege of Mandalore was coming, they shouldn't have included details of it in the Ahsoka novel, because Lucasfilm would not want it to be spoiled for the people who read the book, even if there were no contradictions. This was a case where the story group failed to make sure that 2 projects being developed at the same time that were overlapping worked with one another harmoniously. I honestly think the show was better off for making the Siege of Mandalore exactly what it needed to be to give the Clone Wars the send-off it deserved, but someone needed to keep the author of Ahsoka clued into the plan plan, which is the whole reason we were told the story group exists. Once again, I'm not too angered by this one since it only contradicts flashbacks from the Ahsoka book and not the main story, and ultimately I think it was worth the retcon so that the Clone Wars could be finished in exactly the way that the writers thought it should be done. But I still think there needs to be more thought put into the details of stories that are being developed at the same time so that these retcons don't need to keep happening. That brings us back to the Bad Batch premiere and the Kanan comic. In the comic, the region of the planet Collar where Kanan, Depa, and their clones were fighting had mild weather rather than snow. They breach a citadel and the Separatist leaders flee, but the local officials dislike both the Separatists and the Republic. So Depa has her troops sleep outside so as not to be disruptive to the lives of the locals and prove that the Republic is morally upright. This is a bit of characterization for Kanan's master that I thought was really cool to see in the comics. We also see how Kanan is friends with the captain and commander in their clone force, and that they have good rapport with Balaba as well. Then, at night, the clones get Order 66 and all hell breaks loose. That's when Kanan runs off into the woods and starts his life as a fugitive. Later in the comic series, Kanan has a reckoning with the clones who were his friends before they killed his master, and we get some of the most intense scenes from any Star Wars story so far in the canon. And all of this is thrown out so that 40-something-year-old Freddie Prinze Jr. can poorly try to sound like a 15-year-old and then never be heard from in the show ever again. What's so frustrating about this contradiction is not only how good the comic was, but how unnecessary Kanan's inclusion was in the show. His place easily could have been taken by a new Jedi apprentice or one of the younglings from the Clone Wars arc where they go to Ilum to get lightsaber crystals. And if it had been a different character, the Bad Batch could follow up with them later in the show. But based on what we know about Kanan's story, he's on his own until he meets up with Hera much further down the timeline, so there isn't really an opportunity for him to appear in the show, so that we can't get closure for the scene with Hunter. And this version of Order 66 is so watered down that it just makes Kanan's story less interesting compared to what we saw in the comics. I get that they wanted to connect to Rebels in some way, but this was just not the way to do that in my opinion. And I also want to point out that this one isn't even the story group's fault. The developers of the show knew that the comic existed. The planet's name, Collar, is from the comics. The show writers chose to ignore the comics. The issue of continuity at Lucasfilm is about more than just the story group not doing its job. It's also about creators choosing to ignore other creators' stories. And this includes people who hardcore fans like. I love Dave Filoni and I think he's a great storyteller, but he plain and simply ignores things in the books and comics that are convenient for him to ignore, and I don't appreciate that about him as a creator. I think Lucasfilm has promised a unified continuity, and in my opinion, they owe it to their fans who spend massive amounts of time and money on the expanded material to hold true to their word. Moving forward, I think Lucasfilm as a company needs to fix the continuity problem. If they repeatedly ignore the content that they themselves have said is canon, it takes away the fun from fans like me who read all of the books and comics. After all, why should we keep buying and reading the other material if it's just going to be ignored by the other media when it's convenient? This will not only require the story group to get on top of things to help bridge communication between the different creators, but there needs to be a real commitment from everyone who tells Star Wars stories at Lucasfilm to keeping continuity. Showrunners and movie directors can't keep considering themselves above all of that. They're not George Lucas. They should not just override other creators' stories because it's easier to tell the story they want to tell that way. At least that's the way I see it. Well, that's all I have for you guys this time. Be sure to let us know in the comments what you think about all of this. I always like reading what you guys think of different Star Wars topics. If you liked this video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more Star Wars content every week when we can. As always, thank you for watching and may the Force be with you.